All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt McLean, designer, programmer, and CEO of Generic Lake Monster, and this is Accessibility as a First Principle. Let's get started. How do you measure the success of a game? It goes without saying that we always want to make games that are fun, cool, and memorable. I don't think anybody gets into this line of work hoping to make forgettable, uncool games, but coolness and memorability are subjective and impossible to really measure. We can measure profits and sales, and out of necessity, we often have to. But there are great games that go unnoticed and never sell, and there are top sellers that are forgotten after a short time. And for some, a game is successful if it reviews well, wins award, and garners acclaim. And while it's perhaps better to aim for prestige and hope that the money follows versus the other way around, if you are chasing awards and acclaim, are you seeking greatness? Or are you really just catering to the gamers with the loudest and most privileged opinions and the biggest microphones? What if you measured the success of a game based on the total number of players who could play and complete your game? This year's GCAP is all about ambition, and my ambition is to prioritize serving the largest player base possible. Sure, money and acclaim would be great too, but our primary goal is to serve players who normally can't find games they can easily play. And perhaps I can convince you all that accessibility, more than money or fame, is your game's most enduring possible legacy. Now, since you might be wondering who is this guy and what does he know about games, I'll give you a quick rundown. I've been a professional game designer since 2004, and I've worked on a variety of titles in a variety of roles, from level and systems design to writing and project direction. I've worked on primarily role-playing games. Some are action-focused, others more strategic. But the games I made were always tasked with being bigger and better. And I can probably count on one hand the number of times accessibility ever even came up. In 2018, I quit my job at a studio that sold its soul to Russian mobsters and Microsoft and began working on forming my own studio. In 2019, we were 2 programmers and a part-time artist. But as of just a month ago, we became a team of 4 and officially formed up as Generic Lake Monster. As of today, we're working on our first major title with the help of 4 freelancers for a total of 8 devs across 3 time zones. We have no office, no dress code, no overtime, and most importantly, no publisher or pre-existing fans to please, leaving us free to pursue our goals and ambitions. And as for what the team and I are aiming to accomplish, well, out of necessity, we need to make money to afford game number 2, but the real dream is to make games that are playable to larger audiences. We're a small team, so we know we can't make a first-person shooter, open-world RPG, or other massive sprawling title. And there are larger studios churning out and spitting out talented game devs to make those bigger games anyway. Our point of view is that we can make something that has a bigger and better range of players, because that is far more important than merely a bigger and better game. And so that's the ambition of our company. Here's the ambition for this talk. First, I want to talk some accessibility design principles, not because I know everything about the theory, but more to get you all on the same page with how I've come to understand a subject on which I have no formal training, only lots of trial and error, mostly error. Then I'm excited to share a sneak peek at a game we've been working on for a few years that's been envisioned from the ground up with accessibility as a primary goal. And while our game isn't final or even out of alpha just yet, we have and still have going on nearly a half dozen playtesters with varying challenges and impairments testing our gaming and letting us know where we've delivered and where we've fallen short. And through it all, I hope to sell you on the notion that accessibility isn't an afterthought or a luxury feature, or even a stretch goal that you should finish after you've served players without disabilities. It's a core requirement of meaningful and intentional game design. In some sense, I am lucky. I have a disability that has made a couple of games truly unplayable for me, but it hasn't really prevented me from enjoying and completing the vast majority of games out there. I have a combination of red, green, and blue-yellow colorblindness, which doesn't map to any of the 3 most commonly identified forms of colorblindness. The company where I used to work eventually started thinking about things like colorblind-friendly user interface, but that giant shift in giving a fuck only happened when 3 out of the 3 project directors were all project directors with colorblindness. I've written millions of lines of branching dialogue across many games under tight deadlines, and my hands have paid the price. Most days my hands are reasonably dexterous, but they're starting to falter more and more. But otherwise, I'm a mostly able-bodied Euro-American man of privilege. I play life on easy mode with socioeconomic cheat codes enabled. So even though I'm obsessed with accessibility, I'm also aware that I have a much easier life than the players I'm hoping to serve. And I'm not exactly proud of this, but most of my career has been spent making games less accessible. At one point, I was working on RPGs that could be paused at any time and required no hand-eye coordination. But then came shooter RPG hybrids like Alpha Protocol and Fallout New Vegas that required lots of hand-eye coordination. Then came South Park: Stick of Truth, wherein we shoved time-sensitive mini-games into what could have been a turn-based combat system to allegedly increase engagement and immersion, but there was never more than a passing concern for increasing accessibility. In short, until recently, I've never made an accessible game. I made complex games that were maybe accidentally accessible to some, and I certainly wasn't working on any game that was doing anything positive for the world. Which is maybe a bit too self-deprecating. I have made one accessible game in a joint design production with my sister called Let's See Who Can Go the Longest Without Having Children. Not only is it a game where she and I are both winning, it's incredibly accessible. And it's maybe the only game I've ever worked on that could save the planet from unchecked human proliferation if only everyone played this game as competitively as I do. But on a serious note, some quick axioms of mine. I often play fast and loose with the English language, but years back someone was kind enough to call me on my inadvertent ableist vernacular. The wisdom I was given was it is always better to put the person before the disability. So, I am a game developer with colorblindness, not a colorblind game dev. The distinction is subtle, but it's important to recognize the human being first and their challenge second. Now, if you have a problem with your house and call a carpenter, they'll tell you the wood needs replacing. You call an electrician, they'll tell you it's the wires. I've somewhat unapologetically made accessibility my primary focus, and so now I see nearly every problem as an accessibility concern. You may view accessibility as just a singular component of development. I think of it as a concern that pervades every step of development. And lastly, if you saw me talk here at GCAP in 2018, you'll know I view game development as a service industry. We make fun software products that our customers should be free to enjoy how they want to enjoy it. It is not up to us to dictate their fun, but rather to serve them something that they can savor in their own way. And our customers are players, or gamers, but never users. Aside from the software industry, the only other business I know that calls their customers users are drug dealers. So accessibility has changed rapidly in my lifetime. It just used to not exist. At first, accessibility meant recognizing that left-handed people exist and might want to play games too, so why not stick buttons on both sides of the joystick? There was no concern for gamers in wheelchairs that couldn't reach the control, or gamers who couldn't grip the joystick in the first place, but at least arcade cabinet manufacturers sometimes threw left-handed gamers a table scrap of concern. And if you were struggling with the game and needed several tries, well, I hope you were made of porters. This model of pay money to win has never gone away and is a rot that still festers and plagues game development to this day. While arcade gaming didn't exactly lead the way in accessibility, home computing tried a little harder, and in my lifetime this notion of accessibility features came into being. Vision, hearing, and motor control impairments were the first things to get real support, and it was a far step beyond merely noticing left-hand folks exist. Television movies had made great strides with closed captioning for the hearing impaired, and while it's often bad news when game developers imitate Hollywood, this was undoubtedly one of the better moments of cross-pollination. Subtitles felt like the only real accessibility option in games for quite a long time, and now they are something of an industry standard. And we rightly take notice when a game lacks them or has substandard subtitles. And while games were warming up to the notion of accessibility, there were some early attempts at what I wouldn't call necessarily accessibility design, but warnings of inaccessibility. The ESRB system mostly existed as a way to stop easily offended and litigious Americans from boycotting games entirely, but it did have the effect of giving players sensitive to violence and gore a chance to opt out. And games were quick to add seizure warnings when it turned out to be an issue, which is kind of a bit of a case of the least they could do, since removing the seizure-inducing content would be a better fix altogether, but it was a start. The slow trickle of change has become a raging river, and now accessibility is a talked-about subject with so much more to offer players than in the past. While certainly some developers deprioritize and ignore accessibility, they do so at their own ignorance and peril, as there is now a greater focus on helping players who have vision, motor control, and/or hearing challenges. And players with those disabilities want to play games as much as the rest of us, if not more so. So thinking about the eyes, ears, and hands of your players is a critical step of accessibility design, but it's just the start of understanding the full scope of challenges your players might bring to the table when they play your game. A player with a perfectly able body can still live with a lot of challenges, be it difficulty reading or parsing iconography. Maybe it's a hard-to-manage attention span, or a hard-to-manage sense of panic. And external events to the player can prevent them from playing and enjoying a game. With enough stress and a noisy enough environment, anybody will begin to operate as a gamer with limited attention and hearing, even if just temporarily. Which leads me to a very important point. Not all impairments are permanent. Injuries, fatigue, depression, anxiety, any number of forces can make us struggle to play what would otherwise be an easy game. If your games are built to always be testing able-bodied gamers to the ends of their limits, you have made a game that they will never play on a bad day. And it's critical to note, gamer with a disability is not an exclusive club, and like it or not, you will someday be a gamer with a disability, or perhaps you'll skip directly to dead gamer. And I say this not to be a massive downer, but to speak to your self-interest. If nothing else, consider making the games that future you can play. Now, if you've never considered this stuff before, it'll sound like a lot to parse, and it is. Fortunately, brighter minds than mine have been on this subject and compiling roadmaps for the rest of us, and you should absolutely use these resources. You will not and cannot predict all the kinds of challenges players endure, but you can have a curious mind and a willingness to seek out what you don't know. For our project, we use a checklist provided by GameAccessibilityGuidelines.com that created a roadmap of basic, intermediate, and advanced features that we could use so as to best address cognitive, motor, visual, hearing, and speech concerns. And these concerns are just the beginning. For our own work, it was important we also consider stress, aversion to gore and violence, financial duress, and situational distress. Those are sources of challenge a player might bring to the game when they start playing with us. And we also had to worry about cats on keyboards. That too. It may look adorable and harmless, but thousands of video games characters die each year due to unwanted feline intervention. Now, this can seem like a huge list of disparate needs. Is there any common strategy for all or most of this? Let's talk challenge. As I take a sip of water. Most games are defined by the challenge they place on their participants. Whether it's, can you place these crosshairs over an enemy's head? Can you rotate your Tetris pieces into complete rows? Nearly any game has at its core design some set of demands placed on the player in order for them to progress and win. Now, challenge isn't necessarily bad. Done right, it can be joyous. It can be joyous to spot your own errors and do better a second time. It can and does make victory far more meaningful. But when a player makes a mistake because they are fighting with the information or controls of your game, that's bad challenge. It does nothing to sweeten success. It's just an empty tax on the player's joy. So my gross oversimplification would be to say that accessibility is the art of minimizing needless challenge and distilling only good challenges. So how do we keep the good challenges but drop the bad ones? There are a lot of ways the game can provide challenge, and here I'd like to generalize as much as possible and look at ways that challenge comes into a game. Input timing is the most classic bit of difficulty in games. Aim your crosshairs, move your Tetris pieces, now do it faster, now do it even faster. Scope of demand also comes into it. Asking the player to press a 3-button combo versus a single button is a way to add challenge. Or you can make a more visually complex or auditorially complex puzzle. If you think of Simon Says, on turn 1 it's a very easy game, but as it progresses, the scope of demand can get very long and quite challenging. And how much of a penalty in terms of resources or time the player suffers from a setback can enhance your challenge. This is your fault tolerance. If you can imagine 2 boss fights that are mostly identical in design, except for in one boss fight you instantly respawn after dying, and in this other boss fight you go back to an unskippable cutscene after you die. They could have the exact same challenge, but the one where you have to go back to the unskippable cutscene, that is going to feel a lot harder because the cost to your sanity is so high. Games can also add challenge by requiring outside knowledge or resources, which almost always means money. And those are ways to increase challenge, but unless you are making a bar trivia gambling game, these are almost always forced errors. Modern game design should not be demanding your quarters, and whatever esoteric lore a game demands ought to be available in the game itself. We could add more to this list, but like outside knowledge and pay-to-win design, this list could get filled up with types of challenges that are generally only aggravating and awful. In fact, let's cut out outside knowledge and pay-to-win, since these are only ever enforced roadblocks by a developer or publisher that can't make money without milking gambling addictions. And let's focus on the first 3, since input timing, scope of demand, and fault tolerance can actually make good challenge. So let's imagine that these are our 3 vectors of challenge. A game with relaxed input timing will be less challenging than one with time-restricted puzzles. And not surprisingly, a game requiring complex demands is actually more challenging than one that has simple demands on the player. A game where mistakes can easily be reversed is much easier than one where every decision is set in stone and the player is forced to question how these choices will compound. And these things are all combinatorial and exponential. Having to just shoot an enemy, that's maybe an urgent task. Simple, but it's urgent. Now, if you also had to, like, say, remember the right ammo and aim for the head, okay, cool. Now you have a complex and urgent task. Now, if you also included a feature where friendly fire causes all your misses to permanently kill your friends, well, congrats. You've made a complex, urgent, irreversible challenge that almost nobody has the self-loathing to endure, not even Dark Souls players. But if you just flip these vectors of challenge, you get something interesting. You get vectors of accessibility. As your input timing gets more patient, more players can play your game without encountering a hard limit of reflex or response time. As your scope of demand gets simpler, fewer players chuck your game in frustration. As your game embraces reversibility and rejects permanence, the less mental load is placed on player choices, and players prone to hitting the wrong buttons have less price to pay for their involuntary errors. I view these vectors of accessibility more as vectors of respect. Patient input timing shows respect for players who bring a lot of external challenge to their gaming hours. It's the opposite of having a "you must be this tall to ride this roller coaster" sign on your game, and it lets in more players with hard limits on their vision and motor control. A simple scope of demand is respecting the player's flow and their need for escapism or catharsis. Ideally, you can let a player ease into complex challenges as they desire, but bombarding a player with challenge is usually a recipe for you enforcing what you believe is the right pace and flow for your game. And a very fault-tolerant game is one that respects the player's time. They bought your game. They're giving you their attention for hours on end. Do you want them to spend half that time retracing their steps and re-earning their progress? If so, why do you hate your players so much? Now, for all the shade I throw on how slowly games have gotten accessible, I wouldn't be on this journey if other developers hadn't first made strides in accessibility that inspired me into this obsession. And one truism is worth addressing. No game can be accessible with respect to everyone. You can attempt to come close, of course, but most games will have, by virtue of their style or their genre, just some sort of barrier for entry. But that hasn't stopped some games from trying to break the rules of their genre and opening themselves up to more players. Road Not Taken by Spry Fox is a puzzle game that leans heavily into complex object interactions and has a single save file that cannot be saved or reloaded. You have finite health that rarely gets restored, and when it's gone, your save file is wiped. And despite this very hard combination of complexity and permanence, the game is exceptionally patient. You have all the time to ponder your moves, and even though the puzzles are complex, the controls are just 4 directions and a single button. The stakes are very, very high, but they are never, ever urgent, nor is any dexterity ever required. Now, what I found most meaningful about Road Not Taken, its design, was its consistency. The game is about parenting and caring for the children of a small village. And the developers made a game that a parent juggling a screaming child might actually be able to play and enjoy. I may have quibbles with the game's extreme obsession with permanence, but the developers deserve a nod for making sure that the audience they're celebrating, which is parents, can actually play the game. And sometimes ripping out even more challenge from your game leaves you with something quite legendary. The original Secret of Monkey Island inherited the complex designer logic puzzles of other point-and-click adventures of its day. But then it took the very novel step of removing every and any way the player could possibly fail. You could not get yourself into an unwinnable state. You could not die. You could not drop a quest item. You could not accidentally drop a quest item. You could not purposely drop a quest item. There's literally nothing you can do to lose the game. The player might get stumped. They might not know where to go next. But there is never a cost for them experimenting and exploring. And as far as fault tolerance goes, Monkey Island took the approach of there just are no mistakes the player can even make whatsoever. And that approach worked wonders. It's no surprise the latest Psychonauts game followed this can't-lose model. Now, fighting games aren't normally known for accessibility, but the latest Dragon Ball Fighter game that ends in a Z, I'm not going to try to pronounce, made strides forward with their game. While some complicated button combos are involved, the inputs can be remapped, and many of the combos that would have normally required button mashing, they actually let you accomplish them just by holding the button. And that gives a huge leg up to players who are less dexterous. And while the game technically leans into the permanence category of challenge by having a tag team of fighters who carry over lost hit points between battles, the single-player story mode throws a steady stream of upgrades at you. And players struggling to master the fancier moves, well, they can use these upgrades to level up their really easy button mash or even button hold combos. So this allows a player who's struggling with the game, they can just beat it with simple inputs, provided they put enough time into the game. And sometimes the most enduring trends in a game genre as a whole are those which heighten accessibility. And this isn't by accident, I don't think at all. The early generation of first-person shooters shared a lot of common designs. It was very simple but urgent gameplay. Things come at you fast, you just have to dodge them and shoot back. But they also made sure that your mistakes cost you a lot of time. Healing from damage meant wandering around looking for first aid kits. But as the genre has progressed, some common design elements have appeared across the shooters as a whole. While there has been a shift away from simplicity with things like hit locations, melee weapons, and fancy reload options, modern SPF games have snuck in a way to lower the urgency out of shooters, even if just slightly. Max Payne popularized slow motion, which gives you much more leeway and patience for aiming. And many games cheat the damage formulas when you're low on health or ammo, providing you a hidden buffer of patience in moments of panic. And the notion of having to find a first aid kit is all but gone from the genre. Most allow you to heal whenever you aren't taking damage. This massive shift away from permanence to reversibility hasn't ruined the genre in the slightest. FPS players now just spend less time hunting for healing, more time hunting for targets. So most gamers are going to have barriers for entry based on the style or genre of game. Action games are usually defined by not being patient, and strategy games are usually defined by their lack of simplicity. But there is room for these challenges to be toned down without cheapening the experience. It's worth taking advantage of what your core fantasy does not demand. Players don't play puzzle games thinking, gee, I hope I have to restart my game because I accidentally gave a piece of pie to an owl on hour 1 and I can't get past the Yeti 6 hours later. Yes, I'm still angry at King's Quest 5, rather. And players don't see a first-person shooter and think, I can't wait to crawl around looking for bandages. So when you take these components out of the game, it doesn't result in less game. It actually results in a better experience. So how do we put this all into practice? So our ambition going in was to develop for players that are struggling with controllers or who are too stressed out to get fully immersed in an action game. And this desire later expanded into, well, hey, why not lean into accessibility and serve all the players we possibly can? Okay, how hard could that be? And since our starting team was really just me, another programmer, and a part-time artist, we knew we couldn't try and make a bigger, better version of another game. We had to do something original and punch above our featherweight status. So this led us to what I like to call a AAA game, an accessible action adventure. Even if our game doesn't have twitchy action gameplay, we can still try to deliver the fantasy and experience of an action game. And we wanted this game to be easy to play, but tricky to master. We want to respect our players' time and limitation, but we also want to give them something to puzzle through and conquer through mastery. So on that note, this is where I'd normally stop and ask, okay, who wants to sign a non-disclosure agreement? Look under your chairs. You get an NDA. You get an NDA. You all get NDAs. But not today. Today, it is my honor and privilege to share with you all the very first and very work in progress public look into generic Lake Monster's debut title. Introducing Quarterstaff. Quarterstaff aims to deliver action experience without action demands. Everything in Quarterstaff can be undone, redone, replayed, and reattempted. There is no permanent death state, and every encounter can be replayed, whether to try for a higher score or just to try and play the scene a different way. And while there are a finite number of ways to ace each level for a high score, it is generally a simple matter to progress through most adventures. We're aiming for a game that has a simple path to completion, but a complex path to perfection. In other words, this. We want to remove all urgency and permanence from the game. Or put another way, we want to respect the player's time, external challenge, and insurmountable limits. You'll notice complexity isn't crossed off here, as we want simplicity in our controls, but we also want situations that slowly ramp the player into more and more complexity. That's a small spoiler alert for the where we went wrong, but we'll get to that. And here you might say, wait, if there's no urgency or hand-eye coordination whatsoever, where do you get off calling this an action game? That's strategy. And arguably, we're a bit of both. We aim to have the ease of play of a strategy game, but with the flash and flare of an action game. Quarterstaff is designed such that if a player were to input their decisions quickly enough, the game would have the look and feel of an action game, but that option really exists as a self-imposed challenge mode. The player can take all the time in the world to decide their next move. And regardless of how much time the player waits between inputting actions, at the end of an encounter, the player can watch an instant replay that shows the entire conflict played out in one continuous dance without any pauses. A critical requirement of the game's design is that a player can walk away from the game without first having to press pause. Maybe you have a screaming child in your arms. Maybe your pizza just arrived. We don't care why you put the game down. We just want you to be able to do so. There are no QuickTime events, not even as sweeteners or ways to get special bonuses. One could argue there's little harm in having a game that's mostly patient, except for a few non-mandatory bonuses that come with like little QuickTime events, but once a player realizes that they're unlikely to ever take advantage of those said bonuses, it won't feel like a lost bonus, it will feel like a surcharge on not being able-bodied. And that logic goes for achievements. There are never any achievements based on speed running or actual time spent completing things. While that would be one of the most easiest things for us to implement code-wise, the moment we do it, we've instantly told our players with disabilities that they only deserve 99% of the game's high-end challenge content. In quarterstaff, you assume the role of a magi capable of seeing the flow of time so precisely that the world usually seems to stand still. The player can mouse over intended moves and see a preview of what will happen should they act, even if it's to their detriment. And despite all the game does to preview consequences of your decisions, we still allow you the option to step back in time and undo your action. The player has statistics that can be improved as the game progresses, but the player is free to rearrange their statistics as often as they please, as locking them into a certain build runs contrary to our goal of reversible decisions. Each level of quarterstaff has some number of optional goals that can be achieved for the game's version of level up points, but the player can try a level again and again until they unlock all possible bonuses. The player should never feel like they must get something right on the first time or lose out on something forever. Quarterstaff is largely a game of asymmetric conflict, with the player character always outnumbered but rarely outmatched. The player has countless ways to win any encounter, but if the player wants a high score and some special bonuses, the player needs to chain moves together, avoid damage, and generally make the most out of every single action. The only random elements in quarterstaff are cosmetic sights and sounds. The actual game logic is strictly deterministic. So a player that failed a mission on their 20th action could choose to reenact 19 of those steps and then decide a different course of action on their 20th move the next time around. Or they could try a different move from the very beginning and see how things play out that way. So a player's moves are never thwarted by randomness, and nor can a player keep rolling against the odds in an attempt to short-circuit their way to victory. The intended experience is for the player to have a relatively easy time getting through the game, but getting a high score and 100% completion on everything, that's going to require knowing every last nuance of the game. But if we truly want to address the widest range of players, this isn't enough. We want to support players with limits on their vision. I know how to make a UI that players with color blindness can navigate, but what about those who need scaled up text? And it's not enough that there is no urgency of input in the game. The actual inputs need to be such that the player can enter commands even if they can only press a single button at a time. This also means minimizing click and drag whenever possible, as those two actions may seem like one thing to us, but for some players, it's actually a very fatiguing physical motion to make. We've designed a game devoid of at least intentional strobe effects. We still have inadvertent flickering, which mostly comes from tooltips that refresh too quickly. And this has meant putting gradual fades on any element that could conceivably be on screen momentarily. While quarterstaff is a game about combat, there is no death or dismemberment. The player is never required to kill something to progress, and in fact, the player can't kill anything. We aim to appeal to those who want an action fantasy without the endless gore and murder that often comes with it. And while quarterstaff's soundtrack will likely end up being one of the most beloved features of the game, thanks to the music of Australia's own Edwin Montgomery, there are never any gameplay events or clues indicated only by sound. We assume that even our players with hearing might be trying to play this game at work, and thus have to mute it to avoid being fired. So we use sound to enhance and to immerse, but never as a primary means of conveying feedback to the player. And living with a disability can be very expensive. Being a gamer with a disability can be doubly so. So if we want quarterstaff to be truly accessible, it needs to be an affordable piece of software that the player purchases once and then owns in perpetuity. So that means no microtransactions, no loot boxes, no pay to win, no NFT scams. But really, that's just called common courtesy and not being a greedy sociopath. So all this needs to be put to the test. And that means actual playtesters who face more hurdles playing games than the developers who made this thing. How did we do? Well, though we have a big list of to-dos on our hands to complete the journey, the pessimist in me was pleasantly shocked to learn that we had done several things right that our playtesters greatly appreciated. The simple act of providing an undo button gave us a lot of positive feedback. For some, it was a lifesaver. When they made a mistaken click or keystroke, it just didn't matter. They could just hit undo. And for others, even if they weren't making inadvertent keystrokes, it was a license for them to experiment and dabble, which they really appreciated. More importantly, though, by having no randomness in the game, our state machine could always accurately preview any given move, how it will play. And it was that combination of having both excessive warning before you act and a generous oops button after you act. And that really reduced frustration, hesitance, and confusion for a lot of players. Among the most affirming bits of feedback we received was from a tester with severe motor control impairments and limited mobility. This tester has control of their hands, but not their fingers, so any input that requires button combos or click and drag actions are prohibitively strenuous. This tester usually plays by way of a stylus anchored to each hand, and remarked that on their second session with the game, they had discovered they could play the game with one hand and didn't need the second stylus. This player described their 4 tiers of hard-to-play games. Number 4 is Call of Duty, when you're constantly mouse-looking, strafing, getting shot at, you can't pause, and there's other people shooting back at you. It's impossible for him. Number 3 is something like God of War. It's a complex game, there's a lot of mouse look, there's a lot of button presses, but hey, you can at least pause it. I found that almost more playable. A 2 would be something like Mario Kart. It's an action game, but the controls are surprisingly pretty simple. You steer left or right, you accelerate with a single button, you have those little question mark boxes. And this tester described number 1 on the difficulty scale will be quarterstaff. Simple clicks, 1 button at a time, no rush. And they closed their thoughts by saying they spent years relearning how to play games after the injury that caused their disability. And it took them about a year to learn how to play Mario Kart. And they had said that quarterstaff is a game that someone who's just learning how to cope with the new challenges of their disability might actually be able to play without too much of a hassle. And our complete rejection of any urgency or time-sensitive controls was perhaps the single most effective design decision in terms of preventing unwanted challenge. A tester with a self-reported slow processing time told us how they really liked how there was never a penalty or lost bonus attached to being careful and methodical. Combined with our generous previews and undos, they felt that quarterstaff met their needs and gave them the space they needed to explore and enjoy the game. Another tester with limited mobility reported loving the combination of the game always pausing, but offering a replay of the action when it's all done. They felt they got a lot of action payoff, yet never felt the stress and fatigue of the action gameplay. Testers mentioned that games with unpausable moments could be deal breakers for them. It is tough to ask a person having a seizure, hand spasm, loss of bowel control, or other non-negotiable emergency to please kindly first press pause and then have your crisis. Thank you. Not all players have the luxury of knowing when they need to pause the game, so there will always be a place for games that can be put down and picked up like a book. But game development is nothing if not making mistakes and course correcting, and we had our fair share of shortcomings. We found out very quickly that even though there is only one place we ask for a player to enter text in our game, which is our in-game feedback button, we didn't give that input widget the care it needed. The feedback messages go to a Discord thread, so we have the joy and agony of seeing these pop up in real time. When a series of several half-complete messages came in, we realized immediately the text box into which the player enters their feedback had too many ways for an errant keystroke to prompt an inadvertent submission. While this is fortunately something remedied very quickly, it was a memorable lesson in how we took for granted the idea that the players would be able to press only the keys they wanted to press. And really, this feels like an embarrassment, considering it's one of those cats on keyboard issues that we should have just seen coming. A larger and more pervasive issue was that of our game's cognitive stress. Sure, we had made the inputs of our game simple enough, but taking in the totality of the game's components proved to be a challenge for many players. Simple controls are great and all, but if the player can't quickly and intuitively grasp the current moment in the game, demystifying the game itself can fatigue and annoy a player, making the ease of input an almost meaningless point. They've used up all their goodwill and attention span on comprehending your game, so they're understandably not even going to notice if the inputs are easy to use, because you've burnt them out just having them stare at the game. Earlier in the talk, I mentioned how eyes, ears, and hands are the big 3 that most easily come to mind when thinking about accessibility. And I say that from experience. Having over-focused on how players with injured or missing hands would input their commands, the burdensome cognitive demands of the game went unnoticed. And our most categorical miss was our attempt to support scalable buttons, and scalable tooltips, and scalable UI widgets, and scalable text, all this for players with vision impairments. But to paraphrase one of those testers, whatever y'all considered to be the largest UI and text sizes weren't nearly large enough. We had created options to enlarge all the clickable buttons, but we just vastly underestimated how much larger these things needed to be to actually stand out to players who struggle with visual contrast. Going forward, resizing things just maybe isn't enough. A comprehensive solution means thorough screen reader support, so that the player can demand voiceovers explaining any and every widget in the game. After that, perhaps maybe we'll add a magnifying glass where the player can mouse over and enlarge images in the screen as needed. We had a tester who plays games without any sight at all. Got actually really far into our game, but told us they often lost track of where the player character was in a scene. We had support for a screen reader to say when you're hovered over an opponent or an obstacle, but we forgot to say you are here when you mouse over yourself. And our belief that audio should never be required for understanding the game caused us to forget that some players will need audio as their primary and possibly only means of understanding our game. Our goal moving forward would be to give the player an option when debating an action to press a button and maybe get some musical notes, perhaps like positive notes for the number of enemies they'll hit, and discordant notes indicating how much damage they might take if they actually commit to that move. So what do we learn from all this? The first point may be painfully obvious, but if you want to build an accessible game, you need a group of testers with a wide array of disabilities to discover where your game causes undue burdens. If you just put your hand behind your back and pretend you know what it's like to play a game one-handed, you will never understand how and where your game will fail your players. And be prepared to make not just your game accessible, but the entire onboarding process needs to be accessible as well. Remember that even things like signing a non-disclosure agreement is really tricky if you can't use your hands. And a comprehensive README isn't all that helpful to someone with severe dyslexia. While I firmly believe it is best to aspire to serve any and every player, you can't and you won't. Some genres have non-negotiable elements of challenge, and unless you have an infinite supply of time and money, you will never be able to address every player's need. However, just because you won't be able to offer something to all players, that's hardly a reason not to aim for 99%. And it's important to understand that two players with the exact same disability may play a game in vastly different ways. There's a trio of factors at work: the player's specific disability, or perhaps combinations of disabilities, their access to peripheral gear, and their personal preferences. You could have 5 players with limited use of their hands, and you could likely have 5 totally different solutions for how they're going to go about playing a game. And a quick note about accessibility peripherals. Some of them are jaw-droppingly expensive, support is hardly universal, and there are hidden roadblocks, such as Steam flagging a lot of eye-tracking devices as cheating hardware. If you ignore your game's accessibility thinking that someday better devices will universally level the playing field, your toxic optimism is helping nobody. Accessibility costs more to implement the later you think about it. If you start from your blue sky design with the constraints of patience, simplicity, and reversibility, the accessibility features will hopefully flow out of your work, whereas trying to engineer accessible gameplay into an already fixed game is all but certainly going to require costly reworking, and you might not even end up serving all the players you wanted to serve in the first place. And my other takeaway is that accessibility makes better games, even for able-bodied players. Don't get hung up on what similar games do. Always stay focused on the experience and fantasy your game is aiming to deliver. Eliminate any and all challenges that distract from that fantasy. When you make a game more accessible, you aren't just widening the player base. You are giving able-bodied players the freedom to play your game when they aren't feeling at their best. And remember, you will someday be less able than you are today. If you don't value accessible design now, I assure you someday it will mean everything to you. Now, if someone were to ask me, game theory, what is that? Describe it to me. I would say game theory is empathy for people who aren't comfortable with emotions. And that's true for imagining how players will enjoy your game and imagining how they'll struggle with your game. Empathy is not optional. Designing with accessibility in mind requires an immense appetite for failure and adaptation. Most of us live our lives with effortless motion. We don't actively think about each muscle we move or mentally parse each letter of every word as we're going to say it. It's easy to lose perspective of the fact that what is simple to most of us is far from simple for all of us. So I called this talk Accessibility as a First Principle because one thing I can say unequivocally is that it is costly and difficult to make a truly accessible game. But that journey is a heck of a lot easier if you are ready and eager for it on day one. And to restate my TLDR, accessibility is the art of removing bad challenges and giving the player only the meaningful ones. Consider the vectors of accessibility: patience, simplicity, and reversibility. And respect the player's limits, their flow, and their time. And I can't possibly conclude this talk without a huge thanks to the Able Gamers organization. I could not have wished for a more knowledgeable and passionate group of accessibility advocates. If at any moment I appeared knowledgeable, it's probably because of them. I wholeheartedly recommend you look them up and consider how they can help you make better games. Tell them Generic Lake Monster sent you. And speaking of that, a big thanks to the other Lake Monsters and to our incredible quarterstaff contributors. I could not be here today without their dedication, brilliance, and most of all, their patience. Want to see where we're going? Want to keep in touch? Join our mailing list at our website that's live as of right now, genericlakemonster.com. Or drop us a line at genericlakemonster@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. And speaking of questions, if you have them, please come on up to the microphone right now. Thank you.
And I'm just going to say on the note of accessibility, you can come up to the mic if you can or are able to. Otherwise, I'm happy to bring the mic.
Thank you.
If you can.
That's awesome. Appreciate it. She gets it.
Great talk. Very good talk. Thank you. Was ablegamers.org. My question is, how did you reach a diverse set of testers to actually get that feedback from? Was it ablegamers.org?
Oh, yeah, we actually just kind of gave them a list of like, here are the kinds of players with disabilities we hope to serve. They said, okay, how many hours of testing? What are the time requirements? They created an ad and they found us this excellent crop of players, and they actually found us a whole set of alternate players too, just in case the first round of folks couldn't help. It was Able Gamers who was actually able to find the people for us.
And was that all volunteer work?
Oh, well, we paid them.
Awesome.
We absolutely paid them.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, quarter stuff looks really cool. I wanted to ask, a couple of years ago I got quite severe RSI in my dominant hand, and I wasn't able to play the majority of games that I'd been playing all my life, but the Switch controllers, the Joy-Cons, really helped because I was able to separate them and use different hands and rest my body in better ways.
Yes.
Do you think there is a future for hardware peripherals that will support disabled gamers?
I hope controllers are just always getting better. I got some good feedback from the testers who said that the PlayStation 5 controller was surprisingly good, easy to hold, had great haptics, and they said the PlayStation 5 itself had really good screen reading. So, gosh, if Sony's thinking about this stuff, I'm hoping that just more and more this stuff will matter. An easy-to-use controller still helps us able-bodied folks who are having a bad day. So, gosh, I hope it becomes more universal. Yeah.
Me too. Thank you.
Thanks. Take your time. Hi.
So inspiring, seeing a game being made accessible. Have you thought, or have you used UAP, the Unity Accessibility plugin that helps games use a screen reader?
Oh no, we didn't use an editor. We programmed it all because we're crazy. But if we had been using Unity, that'd be a cool thing to know. Is that like just?
It's UAP. It makes games use the players, the screen reader.
Oh, cool. Oh, wow. Yeah, our game currently is letting people use their screen readers, and one of the details I didn't get into is not all screen readers work with our game quite the same way, and that's going to be a fun headache. But
they are so different.
Yeah.
Hi. So you noted in your talk that your game can't be everything to every player.
Yeah.
How do you choose who to disappoint, and do you communicate to them that they're going to be disappointed and not served by your game?
What a great question. That's a fantastic question. I suppose we just at one point decided that if the player is going to be confused by a grid, we don't know how to serve them. So yeah, there's probably something to your question. Our game should be able to advertise itself as accessible, asterisk. Perhaps if you find a grid full of objects overwhelming, maybe it's actually not an accessible game. I think that's a really good question. I think there's rating systems for things like violence, sex, and tobacco use. Perhaps there's someday going to be accessibility ratings in terms of what things are easy and versus like gosh, this game requires a lot of hand-eye coordination. Maybe don't even bother. Perhaps we'll have some sort of universal code for that. That might actually be a good thing. It's a good question. think we have a few more minutes. Any more questions, concerns, thoughts? No? Okay, cool. Thank you, everybody.